Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lori Lowell. I'm the Executive Director of Home Haven. And I'm very pleased to announce that today's program is Befriending Mortality, a conversation about death. And our speaker is Holly Pruitt. I will give you a brief bio and then turn it over to Holly. So Holly Pruitt is the daughter of Jane Jervis, a founding member of Home Haven. Holly grew up in New Haven, but has lived in Portland, Oregon since 1980, where she served the nonprofit sector for over 30 years. For the last 12 years, she has been a leader in the emerging death literacy movement. Holly is professionally trained as a funeral celebrant and an end-of-life doula, and is certified in thanatology by the Association for Death Education and Counseling. And Holly joins us today from Oregon, which is very exciting. Thank you all for muting yourselves, and just a reminder that Q&A and discussion will be at the end of the presentation. So Holly, please unmute. And before you jump in, I just want to ask Jane if there are any words she'd like to share with us. Jane, we thank you so much for suggesting that we invite Holly to present to Home Haven. We really appreciate that. So before she begins, is there anything that you'd like to share?
Well, I'm very proud to have Holly coming and talking to us all. She talks to me a lot, and she's a very good speaker, if I may say so, without being too proud of a mother. I hope you'll all enjoy and be helped by what she has to say to us today. That's it. Time's up.
Good. Thank you, Jane. And this would be a good moment for you to mute yourself. And everyone, you might want to change your view at this moment to speaker so that you can focus in on Holly, who's going to begin speaking in a moment. So Holly, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much, Lori. And thank you, Mom, Jane, for suggesting this talk and also for giving me such a good start in life that put me on the long and winding path to this incredibly rewarding work that I get to do today. I think it's not everyone who can answer a question about their offspring's profession by saying something like, well, they make a living by helping people with dying. Although I know I'm in good company with Becca Allen here and with Rick and Pat. So it's so cool to be able to have this intergenerational conversation here. In some ways, how I make my living now is simply wondering aloud with people about this great mystery that brings us together today. And by being witness and support to people who are trying to figure out how to live with what we can't fix. My Aunt Madeline, my mom's sister, explained what I did. We had the privilege of traveling together to northern Italy twice in the last 10 years, pre-pandemic, to our ancestral homelands in northwestern Italy. And the cousins there were trying to figure out what it is that I do. You know, all of those job titles Lori mentioned, what do any of those mean? And my aunt, who's a Presbyterian minister, said, well, Holly does what I do, just without God. And I'm not sure that's entirely the case. Maybe it's God's plural, but I do live here in the Pacific Northwest, where the majority of us are spiritual, but not religious. And so that's a niche that I get to serve. I do need to let you know that with the sun shining here in Portland, we've got a lot of things blooming. I've got some seasonal allergies. And if I feel a big coughing or sneezing fit coming on, I'm just going to turn my camera off briefly so you don't have to see that. Just preserve my own vanity. But I'll be right back, I promise. So I so appreciate the curiosity that probably brought many of you here today, and possibly for some, it took some courage too, to put some time in your day to come together around this topic. All of us are aging. and some in harder ways than others. That's true among my peer group too, now in our 60s. Some of us that are here, excuse me, want to acknowledge some of us that are here may be living with a terminal diagnosis, may be living with a serious chronic illness. Some of us may be caring for loved ones who are ill, who are dying, and some of us may be living with the grief of loved ones' deaths, either very recent, very acute, or lingering perhaps over some years. So I want to begin by honoring the tenderness that can be present with this topic. And I'm always so touched by the open-heartedness that does seem to arrive when we're willing to face the fact of our mortality together in community, whether in a Zoom room or in any other setting that you all come together in Home Haven. I have the privilege of working with many senior living communities in Oregon, along with families and couples and individuals who are asking questions like, what does it look like to befriend our mortality? To perhaps consider death as a teacher and grief as not just an emotion to be avoided, ideally, but as a skill, the skill of heartbrokenness, of going on not knowing how, perhaps an essential skill of our times, in fact. How can we have honest conversations about dying and about death in a community where death occurs frequently? How do we view death? Why might it be so hard to talk about for some of us? Who taught us about death? How did we learn about death? What's the real work in dying for each of us? Is it our fears, if we have them? Is it the grief? Is it maybe just the paperwork, the bureaucratic and administrative end of things? What are our fears and concerns? What did we wish that we had known when one of our loved ones died? What was the hardest, the most challenging part? How do we help one another with the grief that's present in our communities? What part does grief play in a community where death is a common occurrence? What kind of death do each of us want, if we have any say in how that might go? How do we help each other in the dying process? And how do we prepare to die? Now, I'm not here to answer these questions for you. And if you find them useful, I'm happy to email them to Lori, or you'll have a chance to come back to this recording if you want. I'm here to join you in bringing curiosity and courage and compassion to the conversation. I'm going to offer some perspectives and some additional questions for reflection. And some of the perspectives that I share, Lori has emailed out to you so that you can have for your own reference, but you don't need that during our talk. It's just, in case you want to spend some more time with a few of these nuggets. And then my plan is, as Lori mentioned, to have time for you to share, those of you who would like, whatever you'd want before I bring a close to our time. So back to my mom, Jane Jervis there in the study. I appreciate that she has always been so matter of fact about mortality and was part of many of the conversations that we were having in Portland over the pre-pandemic, back when travel was possible. But it was actually my father's death that was my first initiation into the subject. Now, my parents divorced when I was 12, and then towards 10 years from that, Jane met Norman and began this wonderful next long chapter in her life. So what I'm going to describe about my journey with my dad's death was really my own rite of passage as an adult. When my dad was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer at the age of 63, I learned so much about dying from him, both from what happened in the approach to his death, and perhaps even more so in what didn't happen. I was his part-time caregiver for the 18 months from his diagnosis to his death. But then after his final exhale at home in his bed under hospice care, within about an hour, he was zipped into a body bag and taken away for direct cremation. No funeral, no memorial of any kind. Very common in this part of the country where people just don't see a value in it. I was given some of his ashes in a yogurt container, along with some of his personal effects by his wife, my stepmother, and a veteran's flag that she had thought we should obtain as his due, as part of my what was due to me as his daughter. It was figuring out a grief ritual on my own that in some ways led me into my vocation as a funeral celebrant. It took about 10 years, but I can look back and I can see the breadcrumb trail that connected those. Now, when I did become a funeral celebrant and a home funeral guide and a death doula, I continued to learn my father's death in new ways through the lens of my professional training, but even more so through witnessing the deaths and the grief of my many clients. And then when I passed the age that my stepmother was when she was widowed, 55, and I'm now on the doorstep of the age that my father was when they discovered his fatal tumor, I'm learning his death in a new way. We have so many unspoken views about death and dying, and so many euphemisms to avoid saying the word. It's kind of a fun parlor game, in fact, to identify all the euphemisms and where they may come from. But one of the strangest to me, the one I want to call out here, is the use of the term end of life to refer to death generally. Dr. Sherwin Newland, who wrote the book, How We Die, wrote, "We've been given the miracle of life because trillions upon trillions of living things have prepared the way for us and have died, in a sense, for us. We die in turn so that others may live." The tragedy of a single individual, he writes, becomes, in the balance of natural things, the triumph of ongoing life. But for the most part, we don't see it that way. We may see death as a failure, death as a defeat, and death as something that if you talk about, you might catch. So it's best to be avoided. But this taboo, this cultural taboo, in sort of, I'm not talking about every corner, but in our dominant culture, it has started to lift with what's been called the death positive or the positive death movement, the conscious dying movement, the proliferation of death cafes and death salons and death midwives and death doulas and many wonderful movies and books and podcasts. In fact, a year or two before the pandemic, the New York Times ran a feature about all of this cultural burgeoning that was called Death is Having a Moment in the Sun. And just recently, Forbes wrote about what they called the significant shift in the way our culture talks about grief. They opened the article with the question, is it no longer taboo to talk about death? It seems like the once avoided topic is now popping up everywhere. Now, I studied for a number of years with a man named Stephen Jenkinson in Canada. He wrote the book Die Wise and was featured in a film called Grief Walker that's available through the National Film Board of Canada. And he was the director of the largest palliative care at home program based in Toronto, master's in divinity from Harvard. And he has a strong cultural critique about the death phobia in North America. And so he was asked, with this burgeoning of conversation, what he thought about what he calls all the positive PR death is having. Death's out there having a moment in the sun. And he said, well, in North America, we have a great talent for demythologizing, for turning a wolf into a poodle so it will sit on our laps. But death will not tolerate that kind of domestication, he says. It'll go dormant for a while until somebody looks across the desk from you and says, I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do for you. And it's my sense that in many ways, the pandemic was a collective encounter with the wolf. It was really just after death was declared to be having a moment in the sun that parts of the world and our country, and particularly specific communities of color, experienced a mass death event. It's hard to even remember right now. We're back to normal times, but we had 1 million dead of COVID-19 in less than 2 years in this country, and many dying without loved ones around them, without proper grief rituals to comfort those that they left behind. And it was during that time that many of us became aware in a deeper and more unavoidable way of the deaths caused by systemic racism, by unconscious bias in policing, by white supremacist and white nationalist violence. And of course, the ongoing epidemics of gun violence, of overdose deaths, of deaths by suicide. And we're in the midst of so many deaths through war, the inequitable distribution of nutritious food and safe and affordable housing, clean air and water, livable climate conditions, and healthcare. So we have a death positivity movement upholding the idea of a good death. But how many of these deaths can be called a good death? The poet Mark Nepo writes, we experience the nature of reality when we witness a death. We are here. We remember. Death asks only for our unbiased attention. Death asks only for our unbiased attention. But how many of us can honestly say we're truly unbiased when it comes to death? Wow, I struggle with this every day when I notice, what's coming up and where does that come from? Each of us likely sees death through our own particular lens. It could be a religious or cultural belief. It could be family history. It might be for some media depictions if they've never been exposed to death directly. A personal experience informed by deaths in our own lives, or perhaps even an encounter with our own death through a near-death experience medically, through a psychedelic experience, a meditative experience, or a dream. It's for this reason, all these different lenses that Stephen Jenkinson calls death the big tent of our times. We are all under it. So we'll take a look around to see death in some of its guises. There is that notion of the good death, and isn't that something that we would each want for ourselves and for everyone that we care about? But how would each of us even define that? For some, death is a relief and a release. Ram Dass called it taking off a tight shoe that you've worn well. There are deaths that are long expected and again come as a mercy. I remember my Nona, my grandmother, Jane's mother, saying, she was done. She was done. She was ready. And then there's deaths that are sudden, unexpected, untimely, tragic. And some of these are absolutely sudden deaths due to accident, deaths due to violence. But many of those deaths that feel sudden actually might have been foretold if we were able to see what was happening. I had a good friend and neighbor who was dying, and I visited him every day, and he was in and out of consciousness. Every time the hospice nurse would say, I think I won't see him alive again, but he would rally. He didn't want to give up. And in one of those rallies, he was speaking to a friend. I was holding the phone up to his face. He couldn't actually hold the phone. And he said to her, well, I don't know what my dying is going to look like. Maybe Holly knows. I was a little horrified. I thought, you're the one there doing it. I'm looking to learn from you. But he was quite a bit older than me. But afterwards, I said to him, Bill, when you said you weren't sure what your dying would look like, is that something you see happening in the future? And he said, oh, is that what's happening now? And it touched me so deeply because he had a lifelong meditative practice, in part focused on wanting to be conscious and wanting to be able to release, as Ram Dass had described it. But when it came to that time between the pain medication, the struggle his body was having with the food that he still wanted to take in to keep up his strength, and the terrible constipation that comes with the painkillers, he was very confused about what was happening. Does that mean it wasn't the good death that he had hoped for? And did it mean then when he died that it was sudden? Or was it something actually, many of you have experience with hospice and know that while you're eligible for the expected final 6 months, that many people don't enter hospice until actually the final weeks or even days, not availing themselves of what was possible beforehand in terms of support for fear of it killing them, right? For fear of quitting. And so then their death feels sudden, when in fact it had been, the wolf had been circling the room for quite some time. So looking at a few other lenses, death, of course, is a biological event. It can also be seen, understood, experienced as a psychological or an emotional journey. It can be viewed in spiritual or in metaphysical terms. We all know that it can be highly medicalized, something that you're likely working with, those of you working with Becca Allen are trying to avoid. And it can entail a lot of red tape. It can even entail legal proceedings. It can also be understood as a social event affecting or involving far more than the one who is dying. The writer Dag Hammarskjöld spoke to this, saying, if death is to be made a social function, then grant me the favor of sneaking out on tiptoes without disturbing the party. Death can also be a political event, such as George Floyd's killing, can be symptomatic of something larger, something that has a larger impact. And it can also be viewed through a cultural lens, or even as a cultural necessity. There's a writer named Martín Prechtel, whose ancestry is with the indigenous people in Guatemala. And he tells this story about a village headman who became terribly ill, and the missionary said, well, we have to take you to the hospital in the city, because if you die, what will happen to your people? And he said, well, when I die, my people will gather from the shores to the top of the mountain, and they will cook all of our foods, and they will sing all of our songs, and they will tell all of our stories. So if I don't die, what will happen to my people? It can probably be understood as one of the great historic functions of culture to help people understand death as part of that great wheel of life, not as the end of life. Cultures throughout history have personified death in their stories, sometimes in terrifying form. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, for example, or the Grim Reaper, but sometimes as a benevolent deity, the angel of death. Santa Muerte in Mexican folk religion is associated with healing, with protection, and with safe delivery to the afterlife. One of my favorite depictions is from a classic 1962 Twilight Zone episode where death was personified by a baby-faced Robert Redford. And if I were showing you slides here, I have a screen capture for it. And the woman that he was visiting was not pleased, even though it was Robert Redford. It's still terrifying to her. So here we are in what's often called the Great Salad Bowl of 21st century America. We have hundreds of ancestral cultures that are tossed together here. Many of us having come to this place, wherever it is on this continent, through the movement of generations that cut us off from what was once our people's indigenous ways of understanding death and of caring for our dead, of approaching our own deaths. In fact, for me, I was needing to go back to northwestern Italy to actually visit a graveyard that had ancestors' bones in it. That's not something I ever did on this side of the Atlantic. So and some of us, of course, have those very intact traditions. There are such important traditions in the Black community of homegoings, of burial societies in Jewish and Muslim communities, of the Quaker community care teams that oversee the burial and the funeral rites. And so many of us are still embedded. And for communities, especially those that face systemic racism, for immigrant and refugee communities, holding dear to these traditions is an essential part of cultural survival. But for the rest of us, and this is why I'm never apologetic about speaking to an all or mostly white audience, because we are the ones that for the most part have left behind or no longer find value in or feel connected by or were rejected by whatever may have happened, the ways that people did it, our people did it in the past. And so many of us are left with a spiritual and consumer marketplace where those of us with the means can sample or purchase just about any practice and try to sort of design my life, my death, my way, as we do in an individualistic and consumer culture. But we may find, when it comes right down to it, that we're in the same position as the boxer Mike Tyson, who said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So my father, for example, never would have wanted to live with the severe impairments and disabilities brought about by his brain cancer. He was very arrogant about his health and might even say, sadly, if he saw somebody in a wretched condition on the street, if that ever happens to me, put a pillow over my face. But when he got there, he found enjoyment in every one of the days in those 18 months from diagnosis to death. Would not have hastened that. But for my stepmother, for his wife, it would have been so much more merciful if his death had come sooner, given that it was the inescapable conclusion. And she was known to say in moments of exhaustion and exasperation, I didn't sign up for this. That was not in the plan. Wendell Berry, the farmer, environmentalist, and poet, writes, it may be that when we no longer know what to do, we've come to our real work. And then when we know, no longer know which way to go, when we no longer know which way to go, we've begun a real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. Death in this time, in my view, for many of us, it can be baffling. Any one of us can be bewildered or perplexed when it comes to our own death, or to the way those close to us or those that we support relate to their dying time. I've come to understand that for myself, some of my own fears and those of many that I work with relate to what we can't control. We are in a competency addicted culture, and I have excelled at that, right? So when it comes to what we can't control, what we can't master, this brings me back to that skill of heartbrokenness. And I turn often to a few perspectives I'll share with you now about how we befriend mortality in a solution-oriented culture. The writer Parker Palmer, some of you may know, he says, the human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed exactly as it is. Megan Devine, a young widow from here in my corner of the country who wrote the book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, and runs an organization called Refuge in Grief. She says, some things can't be fixed. They can only be carried. And it's my belief they're carried best with some help. And the West African teacher, Sabanfu Somé, whose elders sent her to this country so that the rest of the world might not be at such risk by what our culture has such trouble with. She said, I believe greatly that the future of our world depends on the manner in which we handle our grief. And there's plenty of occasion for grief now, how we handle it. So the last perspective I want to share with you before turning to all of you is from the Tibetan book of Living and Dying. What they say is that what a dying person most needs to be shown is as much unconditional love as possible. Don't think you need to be an expert. Be natural. Be yourself. Be a true friend. And the dying person will be reassured that you are really with them, one human being to another. So this is my invitation to you now as one human being to another, to 41 human beings, 40 human beings on the other side of the screens, and as members of this caring community. This is a community discussion. You might want to switch your view to a gallery so you can see each other. And let's talk about this. This is a chance for you to share whatever you like about this question of how do we befriend our mortality? What questions do you have? What are your fears and aspirations? So you don't have to pose a question for me to answer. You may just want to share something that came up for you as I was going through the different lenses of this kaleidoscope. But I'm also happy to try to respond if you do have a question for me. And as Lori said afterwards, Home Haven will take a look at whether to keep private and not part of the recording, the comments shared here, or whether it is a conversation that you might want other members of your community to have access to on the recording. And Lori will help us keep track of the time. And after we have some of this discussion, I've got another piece to share with you to close. But we can now start to look for people raising their hand, waving, so you can unmute. And I'd love to hear how this topic is with you.
Okay, let's see. So please go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to say something and unmute yourself. Holly, on behalf of all of us, thank you. Thank you for opening up the conversation for us, for your wisdom and your gentleness. What a lovely combination.
Thanks, Laurie.
A lovely combination.
Judith Colton, you wanted to?
I do have something to say. I don't know if I can say it though. I thought it was beautiful, Holly, and I really want to echo what Lori just said because it was very moving. It was beautiful, and it was right in so very many ways. When you were talking, I thought to myself, I should have stayed in the hospital room last year when my husband was dying, but we, the daughters and I, didn't. And the reason we didn't was that we thought that he wouldn't actually slip away quietly if we were there. So that's to me a kind of a conundrum. I don't know if you have a thought about that, but there's the push and pull of where you leave someone to finish in a way, and where you're there with the love that you've expressed all day and all week and all, you know, it's an interesting problem that I never thought there would be. So I had actually experienced an earlier death of a partner who died right in front of me. And I don't frankly think, I mean, you know, as you said, you experience something firsthand and it marks you forever. I don't feel I needed that in this more important later episode. But on the other hand, I was glad I was there because there were 3 or 4, it was in Britain, and there were 3 or 4 of these sort of nurses and people from different organizations in the room, and they all had their backs to it, except for me, and it felt very special in that way. So you just never know, but I think either way it works out. It's acceptable.
Yeah. Oh, Judah, thank you for sharing those experiences and posing such a beautiful question. It is one of those questions that there's no one right answer
Have an
to.
answer.
Right? But when you started, I think, by saying that maybe you wished, and I think
During your
those,
talk, I did.
that those, you know, where we do sometimes have regrets and can reflect back on something we might call regret, that part of the legacy of that experience might be that it opens our minds and our hearts to other possibilities in other places, or just removes the certainty. Certainty can be very reassuring, but it can also be very limiting, right? Because the way that you've wrestled with this question helps to touch on so many beautiful aspects. We've probably, many of us, had that experience of, you know, the person where their hand is being held on their deathbed and people are all gathered, and it's only when everybody leaves that the person dies, and people sometimes feel very bereft. We wanted to be there, but maybe that is what that person needed. And then other people, you know, I had a dying friend who clutched my hand just an hour or two before her death and said, "Are you with me for the long haul?" You know, there was no way that she wanted to be left. And perhaps there's something going on that we can't even understand, right? But to be able to wonder about it and to be able to see both the beauty and the things that are hard in a variety of different settings. Thank you for speaking to that.
Thank you.
I see that John is unmuted. John Deming, were you?
Yeah, you covered what I was just thinking about, people wanting everyone to leave the room before they died. And I just, as a follow-up to that, I was wondering, in your experience, how many people die, as we would say, in their sleep, or die during the day when their family is gathered around?
Gosh, interesting question. And if anybody else has like statistics on that, you know, you're welcome to offer them. I don't know, because also there's so much that has intervened now around extending life, and then the sedation and pain medication that can be so merciful in hospice can really add an overlay around when there's consciousness and when there's not. And I guess just in my experience, I would say that I've probably heard equally from people who, thought, gosh, we wished we'd been there, and we feel like we were derelict of our duty or somehow missed out on something by not being there. And people who are able to say that's exactly how it needed to happen if they died without their people present. And then other people who were holding the hand, they were in the room, and maybe it's not even noticeable. It's just they look up from their book and they realize there's no longer that rise and fall of the chest, or there's no longer that death rattle. So I don't know how to quantify it. I can just say, yeah, all as so many pieces, so many ways that it may happen that may feel very familiar or expected or comfortable, and then so many times when we can be confounded by, oh, we didn't expect that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I just one other thing that for people that die unexpectedly, what it's been said is that life's not fair. So sadly, that might be the case. I hope it's enjoyable till that point.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, John. And I see Trisha's hand up, but to that piece of it not being fair, and I didn't talk about this much, or sort of being cheated, it's just a fascinating underlying perspective that we're all entitled to a certain number of days, right? And if our death comes sooner, that we've somehow been robbed or cheated. And it was part of Stephen Jenkinson's work with a number of dying children and with their parents. And of course, we don't wish that for anybody, but is there somehow less value or beauty to a shorter life? Is that somehow negated because that life wasn't whatever we expect to be a long life? And now that longevity is, extended so much and beyond what some people actually consider quality of life, again, what is our notion of the right amount of time to die? Yeah. Trish, I see your hand up.
I am quite familiar with death. My parents both died by the time I was 17. I didn't see either of them at the moment of death. My son died 3 years ago, and thanks to Rick's graciously driving me to the hospital in Boston where he was in a medical coma, I was able to be with him on the last afternoon of his life, as was his father, from whom I was divorced. I found it very comforting to be able to hold my son's hand, and I wanted to believe that he could hear me even though he was in the coma. And my former husband felt the same way, that there was a presence there that allowed us to share with him how much love we had for him. And that was very, very comforting. The memorial service that we had for him on Zoom allowed friends of his from high school and grade school across the country to share stories of him with us. And that brought a great comfort to us as his survivors. So even though someone's in a medical coma, you can still have the sense that you are still communicating with him as he crosses over into the world to come.
Trish, thank you so much for sharing that. And it's been one of my biggest understandings through my work, is that relationships don't end at the time of shift in consciousness, death. And again, there may be a variety of spiritual and religious beliefs about that, but it's a big part of my work really is to support the transition from the relationship of to walking around healthy people, to one person who's not dying and one person who is dying, to one person who's dead. And one of my biggest teachers in this was a client who told me of her wife's memorial service, or funeral, actually, or burial, that I was not to refer to her in the past tense. Because as she witnessed the dying, and as the dog in their bed witnessed the dying, it was very clear to her that for her wife was still present in a different form, in a non-physical form. And it was a beautiful languaging challenge to be able to speak about her wife, not in the past tense, without people thinking that I was grammatically incorrect or didn't understand that I was at a graveside service. And I've since seen in other cultural traditions, for example, I heard a Black state senator memorialize one of her colleagues with a direct address. There was no talking about the person being honored in the third person or the past tense. It was a present tense direct address to her, who was understood by the speaker as still being present in another form. So these liminal states of consciousness as well, in terms of coma, are another way that happens. And also neurological issues, dementias, and where someone may be in another realm in some ways, but there is still a way to relate, perhaps, if we're able to get out of what is fixed and what is known and go on that journey together. I see Richard's hand up.
I'm trying to decide how much all this is relevant to me. My wife died 3 months ago in 3 hours.
Hmm.
Everything was fine. She had a massive brain hemorrhage. She was, the damn doctors, even though there was a DNR, made me have to keep asking, is she dying? Because I knew if she was, I had to tell them to let her die. I have no religious beliefs. My grieving is profound, but I'm trying to move on.
Mhm.
And I get frustrated by what to me is often, I'll put it in quotes so it's not too so insulting, glib remarks about how to deal with death and life isn't fair and that kind of stuff. I knew she had a hemorrhage. It could happen to anyone. I had to suffer as a result for it. The good thing was she died quickly. And I watched her die. I was there and I didn't like it. I had never seen a corpse, but I knew she was a biologist, and I knew she would say to me, look at me, it's okay. So I did. I have a bad image of her jaw was slack. That'll last with me forever. So I'm not sure how much all this is applicable to me, although it was interesting to listen to. Oh, and I will recommend one thing to people that helped me enormously, a book called The Grieving Brain, which normalized what my brain is doing to me as I grieve, and how it takes a long time to unlearn the reality of the person who died. The end.
Wow. Thanks, Richard, for that recommendation and for adding your experience and this very fresh pain. And if nothing that I said is applicable, I feel quite certain that much of what you said is applicable to others. So adding in what you've been through, what you're going through, and boy, that whole issue of our glibness, our muteness, our inability to speak with each other in ways that really connect with and honor the grief and the questions that may be there and so forth. I know you're not alone in that. Oh. Who else would like to say something?
Louis, you're wiggling your fingers. Is that your way of saying you'd like to say something?
Good catch, Lori.
He's unmuting.
Yes, it is a way. Sitting here with Jeannie Drury, I had an experience that was quite different than Richard's, in that the decline and ultimate departure of my wife took close to 8 years. And I have to tell you that there were transitions for me that proceeded along with that long decline. I learned the difference between intimate care and caregiving care. And I learned several other things. And by the time she finally did die, I had achieved what I thought, rather superficially in retrospect, was I had become a mourner as opposed to an observer. For me, she had already gone. But I want to tell you the most important feature of the whole experience, which was telling your mother about what I was going through, the empathy that she showed. We got together very much in the early days of East Rock Village, several of us around the table, and all of a sudden it seemed just easier to describe my conflicts. And there were conflicts. One of them that I remember the most strikingly was that hospice gave me a bottle of morphine that was to be available in case she had a real struggle. The problem was that it was also an implicit invitation for me to speed up the deal. Of course, I didn't have the nerve to do that. I didn't want to do it. I couldn't bring myself to do it, but it was lurking there as a kind of this could solve a lot of things. It could end her suffering. It could move me over the edge into a different situation. But that bottle of morphine haunted me. Mm. Then when she died, one of the first things the nurse from hospice did was getting a pad, and she poured it out onto the pad so that it could never be used again by anybody else for anything else. Mm-hmm. I told the group at your mother's about the release and sort of strengthening feature of that experience, both putting up with denying myself the possibility of agency and hastening Anna's death, and at the same time being relieved that she did it herself. Mm-hmm. Because I was certainly ready too. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I just want to tell you that one of the most important features of watching my wife die was, in fact, explaining how I felt about it to your mother and several other of our friends, mm-hmm. and the empathy and care that she showed for me. So there.
Thank you, Louis. That's beautiful to hear. I mean, there's so much in your story, but it does strike me in hearing this brief glimpse of your story and Richard's and others who have spoken that, I mentioned earlier this thing called Death Cafe, which people think, oh, that must be some weird California thing. It actually started in stodgy old London, but it was underscored by the belief that when it comes to death, we have enough on our minds. We actually don't need anybody else to come in and impose an agenda. And what many of us need and benefit from is just a chance, a permission to tell our stories, whether they're experiences that we've had, or whether it's things we're trying to process around our own pathway in our journey. So I appreciate so much those of you who are both modeling that and also testifying, as we just did, to the value of being able to break the silence and to be witnessed, to be received with what is going on for you around this.
Whitney Center has a death cafe, which Barbara and I went to, and I still go to.
Wonderful. Yeah, one of the most touching things that happened and I'll share this for a minute, just a random popcorn thought, but as those of you think, if you might regret, speaking of regrets, if you might not regret sharing something, Lori and I can tee up, moving into that time when we want to make sure that whoever would like to speak can. But there was an 8-year period where I facilitated many, many death cafes. We had 25 volunteers. We had generally 100 people who would come. They'd all be at small tables. There was a huge interest in the conversation. But one of the volunteers came, it was a husband and wife together. And we typically would say, please sit with someone you don't know. And he said, well, my wife has Alzheimer's. And so we'd like to do this as a team, as a pair, that they would be volunteer facilitators as a couple. And I said, that's great. So when you hear me give the lead in, please sit with people you don't know, just know that doesn't apply to you. Go ahead and sit together. And he said, well, every day, actually, we are new people to each other. And so it does apply to us because we actually don't know who we're going to be to each other from each day to the next. And that was such an amazing gift for him to share that and to have them in community in that way, being able to bring their experience to conversations about mortality. So yeah, are there others? I see Jean Kerr.
Yes. I think the thing that many of us are most afraid of approaching death is pain. And the idea of having that bottle of morphine there is really what I would like is choice. And so I just would like for choice to be available.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Jean. Yeah, an 84-year-old friend of mine has said, I just want to have 2 fentanyl pills in my house. And of course, I'm joining you from Oregon, which was the first state to create a legal pathway to medical aid in dying, where we had votes of the people, majority rule, to create this legislation, not once, but twice, to create it and to defend it. And so this is a very active conversation, both in the states that don't have a legal pathway, but also with the demographic bubble of those who are living with long-term illnesses, particularly neurological, where they may want that choice before they become the final 6 months legally eligible. And even within that 6 months in the States, there are problems of affording the medication and of losing the ability to self-administer. So I know some of you may know Amy Bloom or have read her memoir about going with her husband to Switzerland, where it is legal to administer euthanasia. Yeah, In Love, it's called. And so there's a very, very active conversation among many about how to preserve choice. And I'm constantly back to my own father's example of how his past self imagined about his future self. I wouldn't want that. But when his present self was in that future, he actually wanted every day. So
He
wanted every day. And what you may know, those of you who follow the, the policy debate about medical aid in dying, is that the vast majority of those who go through the administrative hoops and even obtain the medication end up not using it, but it is the peace of mind of some agency. I actually have a friend who's not yet 60 who is making arrangements with one of the entities in Switzerland. And now they have one that is staffed by native English speakers, because the market from English-speaking countries is growing so strong, who has lived with long-term disability and been housebound now for years with cascading medical issues, does not have a terminal illness, but is thinking, I'm not going to go on like this. And, when I share that, it's so difficult to be so closely adjacent to this friend in these circumstances. So many people will say that's too young. But for her, simply making the arrangements has lifted so much her sense of despair and being trapped. Lori, how are we doing on time? Yeah, why don't you give
We're
us some
doing
guideposts here?
fine. I mean, we can continue. We often will go for a full hour and, 15 or 20 minutes if there's more to say. I wanted to pose an idea for our community. I'd like to know if people would like some kind of follow-up to this conversation. I'm thinking about smaller groups. I'm thinking about meeting in person, perhaps. We could arrange, for maybe within your own village. There could be a conversation, a follow-up conversation in person, maybe with the facilitator. Probably with a facilitator, just to, keep it, to create that space, the facilitator creates a safe space. And so I'm curious, but if somebody has something to share along the lines of what we've been discussing, go ahead. And then if there are any comments about an interest in following up, let me know. You could let me know here if you'd like. And do raise your hand. I have 2 full screens of people, so, raise your hand a bit, make sure I can see it so I can call on you. Anybody?
No.
Okay, Judith, I see your hand up.
If there's somebody else who hasn't spoken yet, they should, so. But otherwise, my question is just follow up from what Holly just said. Is it true then that only still for your friend who has to go to Switzerland, it's only going to Switzerland or having some contact with something about Switzerland that would allow a person who has chronic illnesses rather than anything further to follow such a route, in other words, that in this country that's really still not anywhere near possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there are no legal barriers to voluntarily stopping eating and drinking.
Of course.
And there's quite an increased conversation about that. And even if a person is not hospice eligible for the support in their dying time because they don't have a 6-month prognosis, once they enter into the voluntary stopping eating and drinking process, they become hospice eligible because you reach a point of no return. And so there's increasing support for within certain hospices for being open to supporting that pathway, even though hospice does nothing to hasten death if a person is already underway. Now, that can be a 7 to 14 day process and requires such enormous discipline on the part of the person restraining themselves from eating and drinking, particularly
That doesn't
fluid.
sound
I
like
know.
what
And
I
it's
want
so
at
hard for
all.
those around them. And you need a team around you for a process like that. And for many of us, food and offering drink and even moistening lips, that's a love language there, right? To hold back from it. So for many people, and for my friend who looked at that, said, I don't have it in me to do that. I can't do that. There are other people who even though they know it's going to be difficult, it sort of appeals to them around the stories they might have grown up of people in long ago times who would just take themselves out on an ice floe or under a bush, or it's what animals do, just to go off and to let the natural process occur. The body, especially chronically ill, dying. It's, the body is trying to do what it knows how to do, but we keep feeding it, with food, with water, et cetera, to keep the strength up, because that's what provides comfort, all of that. So that is one option. And then there are, again, essentially kind of underground, and Trish is noting that Sherwin Newland's mother took this route, and that's in his book, The End of Life. Thanks for highlighting that. There are essentially underground networks, websites, and people sharing information for other forms of what is called sometimes rational suicide, self-deliverance, choice in dying, completed life, where they use other means to end their life, not out of depression or despair or impulse, but out of deciding, this is how I'm going to do it. The question is, do you need to do that alone? Then, because you don't want other people to be implicated. You don't want insurance and other death benefits to be screwed up. So it's complex. And I also noticed that Trish says we in Connecticut could write our state legislators. For those of you who are interested in this, who aren't aware of the National Oregon Compassion and Choices, which grew out of the Oregon experience, it provides technical support and advocacy, backup, and expertise, where there are people who want to make that change in their own states.
We have a question or comment from Rick.
So on the same subject of compassionate dying and choosing to, Pat and I have just watched a film by Compassionate Choices, if I got it correctly. It's called Last Flight Home. And it's a wonderful documentary about the father had a very successful life, long life. He said, enough. He was sick. He said, I'm ready to die. I'm ready to die of my own choice. And so he chose, and I don't know what state, Holly, but California, whatever. And they had to go through a lot of rigmarole to get the medication, drugs, whatever, got that. And he had a 2-week separation with his family and friends, coming to talk and say goodbye and remember old stories and old loves. It's a wonderful thing. And then finally, he took the medicine and died with dignity and grace. And what the amazing thing is, the family all coming together and supporting him and each other. Last Flight Home.
Yes. Oh, Rick, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I agree. It's an outstanding film, and I feel a little personally connected because his one daughter
Yeah.
is a rabbi, and
Yes.
she and I were colleagues as community organizers back in the day before she went to rabbinical school. And the other daughter is the filmmaker. And it's a beautiful thing for him to essentially charge them both. And the daughter, who was a rabbi, said, I don't want to be your rabbi. I want to be your daughter. But he said, too bad. Too bad. You were going to be my rabbi.
But she did the rabbi part beautifully. Toward the end, she said, Dad, tell me about what you're not proud of. I'm not saying the right language. What you didn't like, what you did. Tell us about the stuff that you've never shared with anybody, about the bad parts of your life. And so he had a confession with her, not the whole family, with her, getting all this angst out.
Yes.
And it was so gentle to be able to get that out toward the end of his life.
Yes. Yeah. And I see Judy and Richard both with hands up, but another very poignant aspect of that is you see his wife, the mother, who does not want this. She's like, but you can be in a nursing home and I can come every day. We can keep taking care of you. And so the complexity, it's rare that every member of the family has the same experience or perspective on what's happening. And so how could all of that coexist? So you can get that. It's on Paramount Plus. It was actually shortlisted for an Oscar nomination. And so it was produced by MTV, and Paramount Plus is the distributor. If you have an Amazon subscription, you can purchase it through them too. So highly recommend for viewing partners. Thanks. So I think I saw Judy. Judy, we
Yes.
don't see your face, but we see your
Right.
hand and we can hear you.
Okay, so I have a daughter who lives in remote Bolivia, and I don't see her very frequently. So I have a practice of saying goodbye to her each time I leave.
Fabulous photographer.
Because I don't know if, I know she's never coming back to this country. And so we won't be with each other, most likely, when we leave our body. And so there's this sort of a Buddhist practice as well as about treating every day as if you're dying, and saying what needs to be said or any repairs that you want to do while we're alive, and having the courage to say, I blew it with this. I think I blew it. And how do you feel, so that we actually receive the other person's, yeah, you did and you didn't. And there's a way of receiving and witnessing each other at a level that becomes a healing and a path to wholeness. So I offer that to everybody as a thought to practice. Thank you.
Oh, Judy, thank you. That's so beautiful. And yeah, I really live with that awareness too. People will say, well, I'd like you to officiate my memorial service when I die. And I say, well, if you predecease me, it doesn't actually matter what our chronological ages may be. And remote Bulgaria, I'll tell you, sometimes the distance between Portland, Oregon and New Haven, Connecticut feels like one of us, my mom there, might as well be in remote Bulgaria, not to diminish how that is for you, Judy, but when you're 17 and you move 3,000 miles away, it seems like no big deal. But then that distance grows more substantial every day at the later point of life. So it's one of the reasons that I appreciate so much this amazing home haven community that has been built around creating community, because I know so many of you are empty nesters with family far flung. And so as one of those far flung family, I really respect and honor who you are to each other. And I'm so appreciative to get to be a part, whether from afar or when I come to visit.
I think that's a lovely note to end on, Holly. Thank you for that. Thank you for acknowledging us and our community. It looks like Richard wants the last word. What have you got, Richard?
I kept pushing the hand and it's gone away. This is more a rhetorical question than anything else, because I think opposites of things. I wonder why we care about dying with dignity. We don't grieve with dignity. We're told cry when you need to, howl when you need to, which I do. Why do we need to die with dignity? Why the Dylan Thomas poem, do not go gentle into that good night? Rhetorical question.
Yeah. One of my first age peers to die was absolutely of that belief. She had a tattoo on her wrist, and the first word of it started with F, and the last letter started with K, and the second word was cancer. And you could not deal with her about anything through her 5 years of living with terminal cancer without seeing exactly how she felt about it. So yeah, that notion of making peace, maybe that's appealing and maybe not. So I do see that Trish has in some ways forecasted what I also plan to end with, and it's one of the other pieces that is on the sheet that Lori sent out. And it comes from the wonderful book by the poet John O'Donohue, former priest, and this was published posthumously, actually. He died in his mid-50s, one of those deaths we call sudden. But he left behind this wonderful book of blessings called To Bless the Space Between Us. And in my experience, that's what happens when we come together in this way around this topic. Some people are familiar with some of his other blessings for the dying. This is actually a blessing for death itself. And it's a bit of a longer form from the quote that Trish just put into the chat for us that came from, looks like she may have seen Grief Walker that was referenced in the handout. Your death is where your life has always been headed. So John O'Donohue puts it this way. He says, from the moment you were born, your death has walked beside you. Though it seldom shows its face, you still feel its empty touch when fear invades your life, or what you love is lost, or inner damage is incurred. Yet when destiny draws you into these spaces of poverty, and your heart stays generous until some door opens into the light, you are quietly befriending your death, so that you'll have no need to fear when your time comes to turn and leave. That the silent presence of your death would call your life to attention, wake you up to how scarce your time is, and to the urgency to become free and equal to your destiny. That you would gather yourself and decide carefully how you now can live the life that you would love to look back on from your deathbed. Once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lori, so much for all the work to coordinate this. Thank you, Mom, for suggesting it. I'll leave you,
Thank you
Lori, to
so
any final
much.
words.
Thank you, Holly. And if anyone wants to get in touch with Holly, please contact the office and we will give you her contact info. Okay, everyone be well, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Holly.
You're so welcome.
Thank
It's
you.
good to see you all. Be well.
Thank you.